In the markets of Chile, beneath the clamor of bargaining voices and the scent of dust and salt, a scrap of leather changed hands, torn, brittle, and inked with a single phrase in faded Spanish, "Where the sun never dies." No one could say where it had come from, but the seller swore it once belonged to Álvaro Cortez, the explorer king who vanished centuries ago in the depths of the Amazon, chasing a legend whispered by the last Incan priests. They said it was a tomb, but not for the dead. A place that feeds on those who find it and shifts the very skin of the world to keep its secrets. Ships adrift on seas of sand, rivers running against time, deserts where strange bones sleep. Every step closer pulls you further away from home. And yet, someone always follows the map. Someone always thinks they will be the one to return. Tonight you will walk their path. And before it ends, you must decide. Will you escape the tomb, or will it remember your name forever? The market that morning was a quilt of colors and noise. Vendors called out the weight of their fish, the ripeness of their peaches, the truth of their prices. Knives rang against cutting boards, and the scent of roasting maize swirled with the brine of the sea. Yet in the middle of that noisy square in Valparaiso, Chile, something sat in perfect silence. A scrap of leather, no larger than a folded letter, lay on a table draped in faded sailcloth. At a glance, it looked like nothing more than the corner of an old satchel. But under the weak winter light, thin lines glimmered faintly on its surface, drawn in the precise hand of someone who believed in geometry more than luck. In one corner, scrawled in ink that had bled into the hide over centuries, were 5 words in Spanish: "Donde el sol nunca muere," where the sun never dies. The man behind the table did not shout his price. He did not wave the thing in the air to catch a tourist's attention. He simply sat, his face shaded by a wide-brimmed hat, watching the crowd with eyes that seemed to count the people who noticed the map and the people who chose to pass quickly. When someone asked what it was, he answered in a low voice, as if the leather might overhear. He said it had belonged to Álvaro Cortez, the explorer king. At the name, a few heads turned. It was the kind of name that had lived on in fragments, retold in taverns and in the margins of history books. Cortez had been a conquistador, but he had walked away from Spain's empire to chase something older than gold, a tomb the Incas spoke of only in riddles, a place that did not hold the dead but fed on the living. Cortez's disappearance was a story of its own. In the early 17th century, he had sailed south, led men upriver into the green shadow of the Amazon, and vanished. Only rumors returned. Some said he had found the tomb and been crowned its prisoner. Others claimed the jungle itself had swallowed him whole. There were whispers of an Incan curse, a place where the sun's light never faded because time itself refused to move forward. No one who entered left unchanged, and most never left at all. The seller claimed this leather scrap was all that remained of Cortez's final map. It had been torn, perhaps in haste, perhaps in desperation, and passed down through generations of those who never dared to follow it. Today, he said, he was ready to let it go. Not for fortune. He named a sum so low it seemed insulting. But for peace. He did not explain further. In the crowd that day was Mateo Valdez, a senior curator at the city's Maritime Museum. He was a man of patient habits and a private sorrow he kept neatly folded away. To Mateo, maps were more than tools. They were the closest thing the world had to memory carved in lines and ink. He stepped forward, drawn less by the story than by the craftsmanship he could see even at a distance. The leather had the patina of age that no forge or chemical could fake. The ink, faded to the color of ash, was iron gall, the same kind used in Europe and South America centuries earlier. The edges were not cut but frayed, as if it had once been bound to something larger. Mateo studied the words, "Where the sun never dies." They carried a weight he could not explain, as though they had been written in a place where language itself was different. He bought the scrap without haggling. The seller accepted the money without a smile, as if relieved to have passed on a burden. The walk back to the museum was short, but Mateo noticed something strange. People he passed turned to look, not at him, but at the wrapped bundle in his hands. He told himself it was imagination, a trick of being too aware of what he carried. But even the stray dogs seemed to pause, sniffing the air. In the quiet of his office, he unwrapped the leather and set it on a clean cloth. His assistant, Ana Morales, joined him. Ana had the keen eye of someone who had learned to survive by noticing details others missed. She leaned over the desk, her dark hair catching the light. At a certain angle, the map's surface seemed to ripple faintly, like water disturbed by a passing wind. It was subtle enough to dismiss as the play of shadows, but Mateo noticed Ana step back, rubbing her arms as if a sudden chill had passed over her. They examined the markings. The map showed no recognizable continent or coastline. Instead, it was a strange topography, curved lines spiraling toward a central point marked with a ring of tiny suns. Between them ran a braided path, not straight like a road but winding like two rivers embracing and pulling apart again. There was no compass rose, no scale, only those suns and the phrase. Mateo had read accounts of Cortez before. In one, written by a Franciscan friar, Cortez had refused to use a compass in certain regions of the Amazon, claiming the jungle itself shifted under its influence. Another described him showing his men a map and telling them it would guide them not to where they wanted to go, but where they were meant to go. Many called him mad, yet he inspired a loyalty that survived starvation, storms, and the whispers of curses. Now, holding the scrap of leather, Mateo felt a pull, not toward the jungle itself, but toward the story. That was always the danger with relics like this. They carried not only history, but invitation. Evening fell, and Ana left for the night. Mateo stayed behind. The museum after hours was a world unto itself, all echo and shadow. He set the map beside an old brass compass on his desk. The needle quivered, as if unsettled by its proximity. He told himself it was nothing, a draft from the window, the weight of the building settling. But then the needle moved, not in a sudden swing, but in a slow, deliberate drift, until it pointed not north, but directly at the scrap of leather. Mateo frowned, tapped the glass. The needle wavered, then resumed its silent pointing. He bent closer to the map. That faint ripple was back, subtle but undeniable. He thought of Cortez, deep in the jungle, staring at this same pattern. What had he seen in it? What had it shown him? For a moment, Mateo imagined a path unfolding before him, not across paper, but across the green darkness of an endless canopy. A sound broke his focus, a soft, rhythmic noise, like breath. He straightened, scanning the empty room. The sound stopped. He leaned in again, and there it was, the faint inhale and exhale, steady and patient, coming not from the walls or the air, but from the map itself. Mateo's hand hovered over it. The leather was cool to the touch, almost damp, as though it had been pulled from the ocean moments ago. The scent of salt grew stronger, sharp and metallic. He thought of the harbor, of ships lost to storms, of the old superstition that the sea can claim a man long after he's left its shores. Something in him wanted to fold the map away, lock it in the archives, and forget it. But another part, the part that had kept him in this work for decades, wanted to understand. He began to trace the braided path with the tip of a pencil, careful not to touch the leather directly. As he moved along the winding line, the breathing seemed to deepen. The compass needle began to spin, slowly at first, then faster, a perfect, silent circle under the glass. Mateo's own breath matched the rhythm without his realizing. He felt a heaviness in his chest, not unpleasant, but insistent. He leaned closer, eyes fixed on the central ring of suns. The pencil trembled in his fingers. In the stillness, a voice, low, almost a whisper, spoke in his ear. It was not in Spanish. It was not in any language he knew. Yet he understood it. "You have found the road." He froze. The voice was gone as quickly as it had come. The compass needle slowed, then stopped, pointing once more at the map. Mateo sat back, his pulse loud in the quiet room. He told himself it was exhaustion, the tricks of a mind too long alone with old stories. He wrapped the map carefully, set it on the desk, and turned to leave. But he never made it to the door. When the guard found him in the morning, Mateo was slumped in his chair, eyes open, his face calm as if he had simply drifted into sleep. The map lay before him, unrolled, the compass still beside it. The needle spun, endlessly, without pause. The death certificate would say heart failure. The museum records would note the acquisition of an unidentified historical map. But Anna, standing in the doorway, felt the chill in the room, smelled the faint salt on the air, and saw the way the compass moved. She did not believe in curses. Yet she could not shake the sense that something in that scrap of leather had been waiting. And now it had begun. The museum was never fully silent. Even at night, when the marble floors reflected nothing but the pale glow of the security lamps, the air seemed to carry the quiet sigh of all it contained. Old wood settling in its joints, the deep stillness of preserved relics, the invisible trace of every visitor who had passed between its walls. But on the morning after Mateo Valdez was found lifeless in his office, the silence was heavier. Ana Morales arrived before the other staff. She had not slept well. Her mind had been fixed on the leather scrap left on Mateo's desk, the faint salt in the air, and the compass that had spun without pause. The death was being spoken of as sudden but natural. Yet Anna could not ignore the feeling that the cause had been sitting there on the table all night, breathing softly. She found the map in the same place, rolled loosely in a cloth. The compass beside it was still. She looked at it for a long time, half expecting the needle to twitch when her hand neared it. But it held its place. Anna had work to do, and she knew the museum board would want the artifact catalogued quickly. Officially, it was to be examined for provenance, age of the hide, ink composition, any records to match the handwriting. But Anna also had another reason. She wanted to know why Mateo's last hours had been spent with it. In the conservation lab, she unrolled the leather under the soft, diffused light that revealed every texture without damage. The map's surface looked the same as it had yesterday, with its spirals, suns, and braided path. But she had a thought. Some inks, especially those meant for secrecy, revealed more under ultraviolet light. She turned on the UV lamp, the hum filling the small room. At first, nothing changed. Then, slowly, thin symbols began to emerge. Numbers, drawn so faintly they seemed to rise out of the hide itself. They glowed a dull crimson under the ultraviolet beam, not bright, but with a strange persistence, like embers that refused to cool. They were coordinates, unmistakably, latitude and longitude. But Anna's breath caught at the way they looked, not like ink, but like they had been written in something that still pulsed faintly, like blood that had never fully dried. The effect was unsettling. She leaned closer. The digits seemed to throb at the edge of her vision, as if they carried their own heartbeat. She wrote them down carefully in her notebook. The numbers placed the location deep within the Amazon basin, far from any documented settlement. When she copied them again on a separate page to check her accuracy, she noticed something strange. The final two digits of both latitude and longitude were different. She compared them to her first copy. They had shifted, not by much, but enough to move the position miles away. Puzzled, she copied them a third time. Again, the numbers changed by different amounts. It was as if the location was moving. By mid-morning, two others had joined her in the lab. Ernesto, a cartographer who had spent years tracing the boundaries of ancient trade routes, and Camila Reyes, a linguist who specialized in pre-Columbian languages. Ana showed them the coordinates under the UV light. Both were fascinated, and both saw the same thing she had. The slow, shifting migration of numbers. "It's not an error," Ernesto said quietly, tracing a finger through the air above the map. "It's deliberate. Someone wanted this location to never stay still. You could follow it for a year and it would always be somewhere else." Camila studied the marginal markings, the faint scrawl near the edge of the leather. "Some of these are in Spanish," she said, "but others are older. Quechua maybe, and something else. A dialect I've never seen in writing." She adjusted the light and bent closer. "They aren't just notes. They're instructions." She began to translate aloud, slowly. The words were fragmented, broken by wear and the torn edges of the leather, but what emerged was disturbing. A warning about the tomb. A description of its hunger. Phrases like, "It drinks the finder," and "Its doors close on the breath." And a repeated refrain, "The sun waits for no shadow." Ana wrote down the translation as Camila worked. The atmosphere in the lab seemed to thicken, as if the air were becoming harder to pull into their lungs. Ernesto shifted uncomfortably, rubbing his neck. "I don't like this," he murmured. Camila ignored him, her focus narrowing to a single line in Quechua. She spoke it aloud, testing the cadence. The moment the words left her mouth, she felt a vibration through the table, so slight she might have imagined it. But she hadn't imagined the sound. It was faint, but distinct, a whisper coming from nowhere and everywhere. Not a voice speaking to them, but a voice speaking near them, just beyond the range of understanding. Camila froze, her heart pounding. "Did you hear that?" she asked. Ana nodded slowly. Ernesto glanced toward the door as if ready to leave. The whisper faded. Camila's rational mind told her to keep working, to not let superstition creep in. She decided to record the marginal text as she read it aloud again, so she could analyze it later. She placed a small audio recorder on the desk, pressed the button, and spoke carefully, word by word, through the Quechua script. The whispers did not return while she read. When she was done, she clicked the recorder off. They turned off the UV lamp, and the crimson coordinates sank back into invisibility. It was only later, when Camila was alone in her office, that she played the recording back. The first part was normal, her voice reading the words, the faint rustle of paper. Then midway, something changed. Her voice deepened slightly, slowed. She frowned, leaning closer to the speaker. And then she realized, the words she was hearing were not the ones she had spoken. The cadence was wrong, the pronunciation was off, different vowels, sounds she did not know she had made. The language was still Quechua, but not the dialect she knew. And the voice, though it was hers, carried an inflection that was not her own. It was like hearing herself possessed by someone else's memory. She rewound it and listened again. Her stomach knotted. The voice was hers, yet not hers, speaking in a tone that was both intimate and alien, like a relative she had never met but who knew her by name. She caught only fragments she could translate. "I see you. You are near. The road breathes." Her skin prickled. She stopped the playback and sat in silence. The office seemed smaller now, the shadows in the corners deeper. She thought of Mateo, found with his eyes open, the compass spinning. She thought of the shifting coordinates, the tune that refused to stay still. And then, faintly, she heard it again. Not from the recorder, from the air itself. A whisper, this time speaking her name. She turned sharply toward the sound, but there was no one there. Only the map in the other room, waiting. And she understood, with a sudden, sinking certainty, that the tomb was not only moving through the jungle. It was moving toward them. The ocean carries its own archive. Salt keeps names when ink fades, and some nights the horizon looks like a closed book that might open if a single word is spoken correctly. Among the oldest pages are the diaries of sailors who crossed from the old world to the new, and on certain nights their entries match in ways that cannot be coincidence. They speak of a galleon that rises from the dark like a thought that will not let go. Its sails hang full without wind. Its hull is black with age but leaves no wake. The men who stand at its rails wear golden armor, not bright, but deep, the color of coin that has passed through many hands. The ship drifts toward the Americas without sound, and to see it is to feel your own heartbeat change. Those who watched it said their tongues tasted iron. They said the stars looked closer. The morning after the map took a curator's breath, the museum emptied itself of chatter. People lowered their voices without knowing why. Ana Morales carried the leather scrap down to the conservation window, but her mind was already on the sea. The compass had spun beside the map for hours after Mateo's stillness was discovered, and it had taken all her reason to accept how quickly it settled when the room filled with witnesses. Ernesto came with his notebooks, the ones with charts and old coastlines copied from Dutch atlases. Camila Riz came with her careful quiet and the suspicion that words sometimes continue speaking long after mouths close. The three of them stood over the leather like family around a bed. The whispering coordinates that had emerged in ultraviolet lay in Anna's notes. Each time she had written them, they had shifted. Today they looked innocent again, veiled and blank in ordinary light. The museum kept a small archive of maritime diaries on microfilm, and the National Library loaned what the museum could not house. It did not take long to find the pattern that sailors pretend not to speak of. In 1604, a Biscayan caravel reported a sighting near the Azores. The captain wrote that a ship came out of weather that was not weather. His crew saw men standing under the shrouds with helmets shaped like suns resting on their brows. When the lookout rang the bell, the sound did not carry. The air around the galleon went thick, as if someone had breathed into the sea and held the breath in place. The caravel's pilot crossed himself and watched. The ghostly ship turned without turning, changed its angle with a courtesy that felt wrong, and continued west. There was more than one account. A month later, an English merchantman bound for Barbados recorded a similar sighting. The log said the helmsman smelled copper though no coins were near. The next day, fever walked the deck. It went through the crew like a slow fire, leaving some men shivering beside hot iron and others sweating beneath a breeze that felt like winter. The ship limped into port with 3 graves sewn in canvas and a boatswain who swore that a choir had sung under the water when the galleon passed. A Portuguese pilot wrote that his compass spun while the Phantom sailed by, and his cabin candle flared as if oxygen had pooled around a hidden flame. Every diary said the same thing in its own way. Those who saw the golden figures became unsteady afterward. Some fell to mutiny, some to illness, some to a silence that cut through the crew like a knife no one could find. Anna marked pins on a wall map and ran lengths of red thread between them. Ernesto read aloud from a French log stripped of its courtesies by storm and grief. The captain had ordered the men below and stepped forward alone. He wrote that the men on the strange ship did not move like soldiers. They did not look over in curiosity or disdain. They did not lift a hand to greet or warn. They stood as if they were listening to something inside the hull. The captain drew his pistol and lowered it again because the foolishness of bullets felt too loud. That night 2 of his men tried to take the ship. They were not the worst of the crew, and they were not the best. They went for the chest that held the sailing orders and the silver to pay the longshoremen. They were discovered and locked in irons. In the morning, both had fever. Their eyes reflected the lantern flame even in daylight. There is a kind of sadness particular to letters that never reach their readers. In the archive, between ship's logs, there were packets of private pages that had been stored with them, lost as a group when a vessel was claimed by time. A cabin boy wrote to his mother that he had seen a crowned figure on the stern of the ghostly ship. It was not a crown of metal. It was a crown of reeds and something that glinted faintly, like fish scales or coins hammered thin. The face was not visible through the darkness, but the boy felt certain the figure had turned and looked at him. He wrote that his chest hurt as if he had run too far, though he stood still. His handwriting leaned more with each line, as if the paper were a hill. The letter ended with a line that trembled between fear and faith. He told his mother that he would follow if the crowned man called, because his voice sounded like home. Ernesto drew a thin pencil arc across the Atlantic and found that the sightings ran in a loose belt, a river of stories that curved south and west. He traced the belt with a compass and then with his finger. At one point the line crossed the coordinates Anna had copied from the leather when the numbers had been moving. It was only a rough coincidence on modern projections, yet that was the sort of detail that arranges itself in the mind and refuses to leave. Camila pointed to marginal notes that many different hands had left. Sailors called the Phantom different names. In Spanish, the Sun Crown. In Portuguese, the Gold Sleepers. In English, the Quiet Company. In Quechua, where the words came short and strong, the Ship of Breath. The names were different, but they all circled the same shape. A vessel that had learned to move like a thought and taken on the patience of a tomb. The diaries began to cross-reference one another as if the sea itself had started the conversation. A Dutch gunner wrote that the Phantom's armor was not hammered smooth, but patterned with small lines that looked like text. An Italian pilot said the lines were not text at all but rivers, the way rivers are drawn on desert maps, with dots for the water that does not come every year. A sailor from Cadiz said he saw the gold bear tiny scratches where barnacles had once clung, which meant the armor had been underwater for a long time and had learned to shine under a different kind of sun. A pilot in the service of the Portuguese crown claimed that when their ship tried to change course, the sea pushed back as gently as a steady hand on a shoulder. The ship obeyed without meaning to. The helmsman wept quietly and could not say why. It would be easy to arrange these accounts into a perfect sequence and call it proof. The museum team did not do that. They let the contradictions sit beside the agreements. They let two clocks tell two different times and understood that both were right in a place where the hours themselves might be untrustworthy. Even so, a pattern made itself. Within 40 days of a sighting, a crew would either turn on itself, fall to sickness that the surgeons could not quite name, or vanish into storms that had not been predicted by the sky the day before. The mutinies came without the usual sparks. There were no stolen rations, no public humiliations to blame. Men woke with a certainty that their captain had led them into a trap, and certainty is a flame that needs no tinder. Camila found Quechua lines in one Spanish diary where a missionary had scribbled a warning he claimed to have learned in the highlands. Do not draw it. Do not count it. Do not mark its distance. The act of naming makes it nearer. She felt the words like pebbles underfoot in a river. She remembered the coordinates that had changed when copied, a map that behaved like an animal that refuses to be tethered. She considered the possibility that someone had learned to use a curse as a measure. If the tomb fed on those who found it, then perhaps it sent out a ship to feed. Or perhaps the ship had been called by those who wanted to be found. She did not share that thought yet. She kept it close the way a person keeps a small secret at the back of the mouth, tasting it now and then without letting it fall into language. There were reports of cannon fire. One account from 1611 said a Valencia captain took the Phantom as an insult to his seamanship and ordered a broadside. His men loaded powder and lit fuses, and the roar that came knocked men to their knees. The guns spat smoke and reached for the galleon across the water. Yet the balls did not strike. They hit the sea with a sound and sank as if the water had been iron. The galleon did not turn, nor did it send any signal. It continued its slow procession until night swallowed the sight. In the morning, the Spaniards' knives had rusted as if they had sat in a bucket of brine for a decade. The ship's dog would not step out of the captain's cabin. He stood and stared at a point on the floor as if a rat could be heard below the planks. They reached port with every tool touched by a fine red powder, the color of the iron sand that stains hands for days. A letter from a navigator to his sweetheart spoke of a music he could not agree was music. He said it came up through the hull and through his legs and into his bones. The notes did not move like scales. They stood in place like pillars of sound. He recognized in them the peculiar comfort that comes to people when they finally stop walking toward something. He wrote that his feet hurt less when he heard it. He wrote that his mind hurt more. He told her that in the night, when the ship rocked, he dreamed of a door opening in the water and a room beyond that had no corners, only curves. He described a man seated in that room, wearing a crown that was not a crown, and though he had never seen that man, the navigator wrote like someone describing a face he had known as a child. Ernesto had a method. He took each sighting and measured it against winds, currents, and the routes the pilots preferred in those years. He drew small circles where the Phantom had been seen, then extended a line from each circle to the nearest report of mutiny, fever, or disappearance. The lines tightened around a track that led toward the western edge of the world as Europe knew it then. He turned to Anna and tapped the endpoint. If a ship follows this procession, and if the curse crosses water to meet an appetite waiting in green shadows, then the path would bring a vessel to the mouth of an immense river. He spoke the name softly, as if its syllables had a weight that could unsettle the room. The Amazon. Anna nodded without speaking. They all knew who had gone there with a map and not returned. Camila found a set of logbook pages stored out of order, their edges stained with something that had browned like old blood. They belonged to a ship called Santa Marta. The handwriting was familiar to anyone who had studied the last years of Álvaro Cortez. The Santa Marta had taken on supplies in Cartagena and sailed south. There were entries about calm, about a stubborn current that pulled against their will, about a night when the stars looked like the bottom of a well and the men shivered at heat. Then, in a hand that remained steady, the captain recorded that a galleon of no court and no crown slid out of the black and coasted alongside them close enough to throw a rope. The men on its deck wore gold that looked older than the sea. The captain ordered no insults and no prayers. He stood at the rail and watched as if he recognized an old enemy or an old promise. Santa Marta was captained by Álvaro Cortez. The confirmation came not in the name, which any man could take, but in the way the entries spoke to the ship. Cortez wrote to his vessel like a stubborn friend. He told her to keep her hold light of fear and heavy of food. He told her to keep her ears open to the weather and to ignore fools who call every menace a miracle. He told her that if the sun failed from the sky, he would light her path with a candle inside his chest. Camila read the words aloud, and the lab felt smaller. The letters had survived damp, insects, and the drift of centuries. The voice inside them stepped out as if it had been waiting for the precise turn of light that would let it be seen again. Cortez did not fire. He did not turn away. He did not send a man to beg a priest for a rite that could pin a spirit to a page. He recorded that the galleon eased nearer, and to his surprise there was no impact when their wakes met. The two ships seemed to share a single field of water without disturbing each other. A man on the Phantom raised his hand, and Cortez did the same. The Phantom crew were silent. Their armor bore incised lines that swam in the torchlight like fish in shallows. The crowned figure stood at the stern with his face shadowed by the shape of his headpiece. He seemed to pulse with a rhythm that would not belong to any living chest. Cortez wrote that the figure looked accustomed to waiting. That night, a mutiny tried to be born and failed. 3 men came to the captain's door with knives. Cortez opened the door before they knocked because he had been awake his whole life and sleep had finally given up on him. He spoke to them without sword or pistol. He told them a story about a kingdom that exists in a room inside a stone that breathes. He told them that every king is either a wall that holds suffering inside or a door that lets it out. He told them he was tired of crowns made by hands and that he would rather carry a crown made by a place because places are always honest about their hunger. The men lowered their knives as if the steel had become heavy with silt. Cortez sent them back to their hammocks. In the morning the Phantom still drifted nearby, neither closer nor farther. The next pages were swollen with moisture and hard to separate. Where they did not tear, they opened like gills. The ink stretched thin. Cortez's hand remained calm. He recorded that the day smelled of copper, that the men found salt on their lips as if they had tasted the sea with their tongues while asleep. He recorded that fish rose belly up without wounds. He recorded that time itself felt longer, that an hour held more than 60 minutes, that a man could think 3 thoughts between each swing of the bell. He told the Santa Marta to hold her line. He told his men to carry no envy for those who had died in houses. He told the sea that if it wanted him it would have to say his name the way his mother had, and that the sea could not do that. The Phantom traveled beside them until they reached the mouth of a river that does not submit to maps. There were 3 entries left before a blankness swallowed the log. The handwriting tightened at the edge, an indication that the writer had composed himself for a hard thing and wanted not to waste muscle. The first of the 3 entries recorded in order. The captain had thrown his compass into the water. He wrote that the instrument had told him the truth for many years and that he loved it better than most men, but that on this journey it had become a quarrel he could not end. He decided to remove the argument and allow another measure to take its place. The second entry recorded a change in the Phantom. Its crew had moved for the first time, a step like a ripple in a pond. Their armor clinked softly, the sound of coins settling in a chest that has just been closed. The crowned figure lifted his head, and the sense of waiting deepened. The final entry belonged in no timeline. It was not dated. It did not note weather, latitude, or distance run. It lacked the small facts that pin a day to the earth. It was a sentence without decoration. The museum's lab fell still when Camila turned the page. Her mouth formed the words before she could think to fear them. He is waiting. The ink had bled, but not enough to hide the clarity of the hand. There was no flourish, no captain's signature, no amen. There was only a fact that treated the future as if it were a reunion. He is waiting. The pronoun closed the circle tighter. Who is he in a story with more than one man who wears the intent of a crown? A king who lost his court and found another. A tomb that learned to speak. A sea that had grown tired of pretending to be only water. The room did not move, but something inside the room adjusted itself by a hair. The scent of salt returned, as shy as a memory. The compass at the edge of the table, which no one had touched all afternoon, began to draw a slow circle. It made no noise. The needle slid like a minute hand that had decided to abandon the hour. Anna felt a pressure in her chest, not pain, not even discomfort, but the feeling of being called upon to remember something she had forgotten on purpose. Ernesto looked down at the map, then at the logbook, then at the window where daylight had started to thin. A diary from another ship added a line that could not be disproved or confirmed. A sailor swore that when the Santa Marta turned into the river, the Phantom did not follow. It stopped at the edge of the freshwater like a hound that will not cross a boundary laid down before it was born. He wrote that as the Santa Marta entered the breadth of that brown water, a sound came over them like a long breath taken far away. The sailor added that one gull wheeled overhead and then vanished as if the sky had been wiped clean. He wrote the words with a hand that shook and left ink dots where his pen had paused to tremble. Camila did not speak her thoughts, but they ran fast. A curse of movement, a tomb that refuses a fixed position, a ship that sails the length of centuries feeding a legend enough to keep its own appetite well. A captain who steps toward a door that is not a door and will not open until a certain sentence is spoken by a certain mouth in a certain light. She thought of Mateo's eyes open and calm and of the compass that had refused to admit north when left alone with the leather. She thought of how the coordinates had pulsed in ultraviolet like blood refusing to die. She pressed her palms flat on the table and felt the smallest possible coolness rise through the wood. There is a kind of power in stories that never resolve. They keep their listeners from sleeping and they keep their listeners from leaving. The ghostly galleon had followed the world across its own waters and taught anyone with eyes to wonder who had once learned to move a city and then decided to move a ship. The sailors had given it names and then given away their names. The maps had tried to hold the line of it and failed because it refused capture the way a breath refuses to be put in a bottle. Now, in a museum far from the mouth of the river but near enough to be touched by the same air, a final page had answered nothing and had pushed the room one step deeper into a hallway without windows. Anna closed the logbook gently, as if a sleeping child's head needed setting down. The sentence remained in the air. He is waiting. It repeated in the mind without growing dull. It held a cadence that imitated the sea on a calm night when the ship rocks inside the ribs of men and women who stand listening to their own organs learn another tide. Ernesto put a hand on the map case and felt the steady patience inside it. Camila looked at the recorder on the desk and did not reach for it. She knew that if she pressed play, she would hear something that would not let her rest. She knew that the voice would be hers and not hers, that it would say something like a promise and like a warning in one body. The first raindrops hit the window. The lab's lights hummed. The museum's other rooms stood with their cases closed and their labels neat. The quiet had grown denser, more interior. The world beyond the sea had continued its days, and yet for those gathered around a page and a scrap of leather, time felt like a circle that had closed. A king had built an empire out of direction. A tomb had learned to pull those who could not stop seeking. A ship had crossed the width of water to introduce those two ambitions to each other. The diaries had bowed to that introduction and recorded what could be borne by language. They had left out the rest. They did not leave the museum right away. They waited with the map and the logbook, the way people keep vigil without being asked. They said very little because words did not seem eager to help. When they finally stood and turned off the lamps, when they finally allowed the room to return to the ownership of objects, they heard a small sound that no one could place. It could have been the old building exhaling. It could have been paper making peace with the air. It could have been a single drop of water resigning itself to gravity. Or it could have been the punctuation at the end of a sentence written long ago by a hand that still waits at the mouth of a river. In the morning, a visitor would stand before a display case containing the Santa Marta pages and read the last line twice because the mind is made to doubt what it needs to believe. In another room, the leather would lie sleeping under its cloth, cool as a stone that has learned a secret at the bottom of a well. In a third, the compass would wake and begin its pilgrimage from truth to truth as if the floor were a turntable. And beyond the harbor, beyond the edge of the city, beyond the gulls and their arguments, the long water would stretch toward a horizon shaped like a closed book. At the very end of the recovered logbook, beyond the careful script and the measured details, after winds and latitudes and the names of men who had swabbed decks and lifted sails, the handwriting had set down two words that did not need a date. They had walked across centuries carrying their own weather. They had outlived the men who wrote and the men who read. When the room was empty and the case was locked, when the staff had gone home and the night returned to have its way with all that is left behind, those two words continued to stand. He is waiting. The Amazon is a world that has learned how to hide. Its rivers change course without warning, swallowing old channels and carving new ones in silence. Its canopy is so dense that the ground beneath it can remain in darkness for centuries. But some shadows are not born of leaves. They are older, straighter, and more deliberate than any forest should allow. It began with a satellite pass made not to find cities but to study soil erosion along the upper tributaries of the Rio Negro. The images were routine, swaths of shifting green-brown water twisting like veins, until a technician noticed something that should not have been there. At the edge of a dense and seemingly untouched stretch of jungle lay a formation of perfect rectangles, vast and aligned, just visible through the thin gaps in the canopy. They were darker than the surrounding forest, sharper than natural clearings. They were too regular, too precise, to be chance. Ana Morales saw those images weeks later in the museum's research room. They were grainy, overlaid with the coordinates that had emerged from the leather map under ultraviolet light. Those coordinates, the ones that moved when written, had been captured in a rare moment of stillness, pinned long enough for a satellite to pass overhead. And where they pointed was here, to these impossible shapes hiding under trees that had been alive before the first European foot touched these waters. Ernesto traced their outlines with a trembling finger. "These aren't fields," he said. "They're foundations." The dimensions matched no known colonial fortifications, no indigenous plaza, no ancient roads. The proportions were closer to those of ceremonial complexes in the Andes, except this was deep in lowland jungle, hundreds of miles from where such architecture should be. Camila, who had been poring over the Santa Marta logbook for traces of Quechua dialects, leaned over the photographs. "If they built here," she said softly, "it was to be hidden, not to be found." There was precedent. Myths from scattered tribes spoke of Uraq-Marca, the White City, built not of pale stone but of a light that never aged. It was said to have been abandoned before the great empires rose, not because of war or famine, but because it had begun to speak. The people left rather than hear what it had to say. The forest grew over it, burying its voice. But if the coordinates were to be believed, something of it remained, a grid of forgotten rooms waiting for a listener. The museum's records held another clue, one older than the satellite images and twice as unsettling. In the early 1970s, long before GPS or high-resolution scans, a group of Brazilian explorers attempted to reach this very location. Their expedition logs were recovered in fragments, some pages warped by rain, others darkened as if by smoke. They described the jungle as unnatural even by Amazon standards. Trees of enormous girth wept a thick sap that smelled of iron, staining the soil in rust-red patches. When cut, the trunks bled slowly, as if reluctant to let go of whatever moved through them. Birds fell silent at the edge of these groves, and the air seemed heavier, making each breath feel like an effort. Then there was the river. By day it flowed toward the main tributary as expected, but at night, under the moon, it reversed, running backward with no visible cause, carrying floating logs upstream against the pull of gravity. The explorers tried to measure the current, but their instruments failed, compasses spinning slowly in their hands until they set them down. One man claimed to hear the distant sound of drums coming from upriver during the reversal, though no village existed within hundreds of kilometers. Illness struck after the first week. Not malaria, not fever, something slower, quieter. A heaviness in the limbs, a dulling of speech. The expedition leader, a former military cartographer named Afonso Braga, wrote that he dreamed each night of walking through vast stone corridors lit by a light with no source. He would wake with his hands clenched as if gripping something. After 2 weeks, they found it. Not the city, only its edge. A wall of fitted stone blocks so overgrown with moss that it seemed more plant than rock. The stones were massive, too large to have been quarried without tools unknown to any known culture in the region. And in that wall, half buried by earth and vine, they saw the shape of an archway. Braga described it only briefly in his notes, but his words were precise. The arch was built of a stone darker than the rest, flecked with something that caught the light like mica. At its base, water pooled in a shallow basin, and when they touched it, it was cool to the point of pain. The air around the arch felt different, denser, as if they were standing in a place with its own weather. It was here that the surviving photograph was taken. The image, now held in the museum's archive, is blurred and washed with the tint of aged film. Yet the arch is visible, its curve almost perfect despite the centuries. But what lies beyond it in the photograph is what stops every viewer's breath. It is not forest. It is not shadow. It is a night sky scattered with stars. The photograph was taken at noon. The negatives were tested repeatedly for damage, double exposure, or deliberate tampering. None was found. Photographic experts confirmed that the lighting in the foreground was consistent with daylight, sharp shadows, sunlit vegetation. Yet past the threshold of the arch there was darkness, and in that darkness the pinpricks of starlight were unmistakable. Of the original expedition, only 3 returned to Manaus. The rest vanished without trace. The survivors gave conflicting accounts. One claimed they had turned back before reaching the city's heart. Another insisted they had walked for days among the ruins and heard voices speaking in a tongue none could identify. The third refused to speak of it at all, but would sit for hours tracing rectangles in the air with his finger, as if drawing invisible maps. The forest closed over their path within a season. Satellite imaging decades later revealed no sign of their trail. The coordinates shifted, as if whatever lay beneath the canopy preferred to move away from those who sought it. In the present day, Ana, Ernesto, and Camila studied the blurry photograph in silence. It was Ana who spoke first. "If this is real," she said, "it's not just a ruin. It's a boundary." Camila's gaze remained fixed on the arch, or an opening, she murmured. "From one place to another, and maybe from one time to another." Ernesto tapped the star field beyond the threshold. "If that sky is real, then it's not our sky," he said. "Or it's our sky from somewhere else. Somewhere you can't reach by walking." The room seemed colder with those words. The photograph lay between them like an accusation, demanding that someone decide what to do next. The map in its cloth wrapping waited on the shelf, coordinates hidden again until the right light coaxed them out. The shadows in the satellite image seemed deeper now, the rectangles beneath the canopy pressing up against the trees like something impatient to rise. There was no debate about whether to investigate further. The question was not if, only how. And though none of them said it aloud, they all knew the truth. If the city beneath the canopy had already moved once to avoid being found, it could move again. The clock had already begun. And somewhere, in that impossible darkness beyond the stone archway, the stars waited exactly as they had when the photograph was taken. Unchanging, unblinking, as if they knew that someone, eventually, would step through. The river was already high when the expedition set off, its muddy surface glinting under a pale sun that would not last the afternoon. The motor launch cut through the water in a low hum, heavy with equipment and a silence that was not quite comfortable. No one spoke of it, but each member of the crew had felt it since leaving the last settlement, a kind of pressure in the air, as though the jungle leaned closer the deeper they went. The local guide, an older man named Tupin, sat near the bow, his eyes never leaving the water ahead. His skin had been burnished dark by decades under the equatorial sun, but his gaze had the stillness of someone who had learned to watch more than speak. He carried no map, no compass. Every turn in the winding channel seemed to rise from memory. It was late morning when the river narrowed, hemmed in by sheer walls of tangled green. The air thickened, the humidity pressing down on them like a living thing. The sound of the motor seemed smaller here, almost swallowed. That was when Tupin turned to the captain and said, "We are close to Yacuera." The crew looked up from their tasks. Camila, notebook in hand, asked him to repeat it. He did, his tone unchanged. "The water of 2 times," he translated. "Where the past and the future meet in the current. You will not see it, but you will feel it. And you must not let it take you." Ernesto frowned. "Take us where?" The guide didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed fixed on a distant bend in the river, as if looking too closely at any one point might be dangerous. Finally, he said, "Sometimes it sends you forward. Sometimes it sends you back. But never where you expect to go." Anna exchanged a glance with the captain, a man named Ramirez who had seen more of the Amazon than most. His jaw was tight, but he kept the motor steady. He had heard stories like this before. Most boatmen had, but Tupin spoke without the air of superstition. He spoke like a man who had seen something and perhaps survived it. The bend came into view. The water looked no different, still opaque brown, still shifting with small eddies, but the air changed. It was cooler here, touched by a faint wind that seemed to rise from the water itself. The smell was different too, less of silt and more of stone, as if they had entered a place older than the river. Tupin stood and motioned for the motor to be cut. The launch drifted into the narrowing channel, its wake folding back on itself in lazy spirals. The silence grew deeper, until the only sound was the lap of water against the hull. And then they heard it. It was faint at first, so faint that Ernesto thought it was an echo of the boat's own passage. But it grew, a high, bright sound that carried across the water. Laughter. Not the laughter of men or women, but of children, light and quick. It came from the right bank, threading through the tangled roots and vines. The crew turned their heads, scanning the shore. There were trees there, but they were wrong. Their trunks were colorless, as if leached of life. No leaves stirred in the still air. The branches were bare, reaching upward like the ribs of dead animals. The ground beneath them was dark and cracked, as though it had been dry for centuries. Yet the laughter came again, closer now, moving through that lifeless grove as though children played just out of sight. The sound was warm, familiar, and utterly out of place. Camila gripped the side of the boat. "That's impossible," she whispered. Tupin shook his head. "It is the river's trick. The ones you hear are not here now, or they have not yet been born. Yacuera carries both ways." As if to prove his point, a current caught the launch and pulled it forward, not strongly, but with the steady insistence of a hand at their backs. The captain tried the motor, but it sputtered and died. The boat drifted deeper between the skeletal trees. The laughter faded, replaced by another sound, low, resonant, like the rush of distant wind. But the air was still. It took them a moment to realize it was coming from below, vibrating up through the hull. Anna's eyes darted to the water. "It's changing." The brown surface had begun to swirl in slow spirals, clockwise and counterclockwise at once. In the sunlight, the swirls caught glimmers of something brighter beneath, like shards of metal or mica turning far below. It was hypnotic, and more than one crew member leaned forward without realizing. "Don't look too long," Tupin warned sharply. "If you follow what you see, you will not return to where you began." Ernesto forced himself back, but Camila's gaze lingered. She blinked rapidly and looked away, breathing hard. "It was like looking at streets," she said. "Stone streets, lit at night. But I've never been there." The current shifted again, and the air seemed to warm. The dead trees thinned, replaced by dense green canopy once more. The laughter was gone, replaced by the normal chatter of jungle birds. The captain restarted the motor, and this time it held. They did not speak for several minutes. The river widened, and the oppressive stillness eased. Yet the feeling lingered that they had crossed something, even if they could not name it. It was only when the banks grew familiar again that Captain Ramirez looked down at his watch. He froze. The crew followed his gaze. The hands showed the correct time, but the date wheel had changed. Where yesterday's date had been, there was now a new one. July 14th, 1621. The exact date Álvaro Cortez was last seen. Ramirez said nothing. He tapped the glass once, twice, but the date did not change. The river carried them on, and behind them the bend in the water disappeared from sight, as if it had never been there at all. By the time the expedition reached the clearing, the air had changed. The steady chorus of the jungle, the insects, the distant birds, the whisper of leaves, had thinned into a strange, brittle quiet, like the hush that comes before an eclipse. The last bend in the trail had been narrow, hemmed in by ancient trees whose roots rose like frozen waves. Now, the green wall had given way, and before them stood something no living map had ever promised. It rose from the earth as if carved directly from the bedrock beneath the jungle. a massive stone figure towering above the treeline, its shadow cutting across the clearing like a sundial for a world that had forgotten the sun. The man it depicted was neither wholly Incan nor entirely Spanish. His head bore a vast feathered headdress, each plume etched in such detail that the stone seemed ready to stir in the wind. Across his chest lay plates of armor in the style of a conquistador, every dent and rivet preserved, as if they had been polished yesterday. The face was solemn, angular, the eyes deep-set and dark. And yet, they did not look like carved stone. There was something in the gaze, a watchfulness, a weight, that made each member of the crew hesitate before stepping closer. No one spoke for a long time. Then Tupin, the guide, broke the silence. His voice was low, as if afraid of waking something. "That is the sentinel," he said, "the last guardian of the path to the tomb." Ana felt her throat tighten. She had read accounts of guardians in Incan mythology, figures bound to protect sacred places long after the empires that built them had fallen, but none described a being that looked so impossibly real. The captain took a cautious step forward, scanning the clearing for any sign of a trick, wires, hidden supports, the telltale seams of modern construction. There were none. The statue's base was fused with the ground, its surface mottled with centuries of lichen and moss. And then they noticed it. Wherever they moved, the eyes followed, not with the obvious illusion of a painted portrait, but with the subtle shift of a living gaze, focusing and refocusing with patient intent. Ernesto, the cartographer, circled halfway around the statue, heart pounding. The eyes turned just enough to keep him in their sight. Camila muttered something in Quechua under her breath, an old phrase of respect, the kind one might offer to the elder of a village. The statue's gaze did not soften, but it did not feel entirely hostile. It was as if it were measuring them, weighing something invisible against the years. The geologist, a tall man named Pereira, could not resist the urge to touch it. He stepped forward, laying his palm flat against the armor's breastplate. The instant his skin met the stone, he flinched and jerked his hand back. "It's warm," he said hoarsely. "Not from the sun. Not like rock at all. Like skin." The crew exchanged uneasy glances. The jungle heat could warm stone, yes, but not like that. Not with a steady, living warmth that seemed to pulse faintly beneath the surface. Tupin shook his head. "It has never been cold," he said. "It has never been lifeless." Ana stepped closer, her eyes tracing the fine chisel marks along the headdress. The craftsmanship was impossibly precise, finer than anything she had seen in the ruins of Cusco or Machu Picchu. And yet, despite the artistry, there was a strange imperfection, tiny hairline cracks that seemed to branch outward from the statue's eyes, as though it had wept and the tears had hardened where they fell. The captain approached the base, noticing how the roots of nearby trees curled away from it, refusing to touch. Even the vines that draped themselves over everything else in the clearing stopped short, hanging in the air like hesitant hands. Ernesto began photographing the statue from every angle, but after the third shot, his camera glitched, freezing, then displaying a distorted image of the face, the eyes replaced by two perfect black voids. He turned it off and slipped it back into his pack without a word. Pereira crouched to examine the ground. "There's something beneath us," he said after a moment. "Hollow space. You can hear it if you knock." He rapped his knuckles against the earth, and the sound came back muted, as if echoing through a deep chamber below. It was then that the first vibration came. Subtle at first, so subtle that it could be mistaken for the shift of wind through distant branches. But there was no wind here, only stillness. The vibration grew, traveling up through their feet into their bones. And then the sound followed, a deep, grinding rumble, ancient and slow, like the turning of a wheel made of mountains. The crew froze. The sound seemed to come from beneath the earth, from the hollow space Pereira had found. Dust drifted from the statue's shoulders, catching the light in thin, trembling beams. Anna's breath caught as she looked up. The statue's jaw was moving. It began as the faintest separation of stone from stone, the lines of the mouth breaking apart with a groan of age. Bits of moss tumbled down like flecks of ash. The grinding grew louder, reverberating through the ground, until the open mouth was a dark hollow, large enough for a man to step into. No one moved. The darkness inside the mouth was complete, thick, absolute, swallowing the daylight at its edge. Tupin's voice came again, quieter than before, but laced with urgency. "It has chosen to speak," he said, "but we must decide if we wish to hear it." The rumbling subsided, but the mouth remained open, the gaze still fixed upon them. The air that drifted out from within was warm, not like breath, but like the air from deep underground, touched by stone and time. The captain's hand moved toward the pistol at his belt, then stopped. A weapon felt useless here, even absurd. Anna stepped forward, the pull of the darkness like a hand at her back. Somewhere deep in that blackness, she thought she heard something. A faint, distant sound, too muffled to be words, yet with the rhythm of speech. It was calling them, not with force, but with invitation. And as they stood before the open mouth of the sentinel, the air in the clearing seemed to hold its breath. The jungle beyond was gone, replaced by a silence so deep it felt like they were already inside something vast. No one spoke. No one dared. And then, from the depths below, the voice came again, louder this time, echoing through the hollow earth. Not words. Not yet. Only the sound of something vast shifting in the dark, as if the ground itself had begun to wake. The mouth of the sentinel waited like a cave cut into a face. No rain reached it. No leaf dared fall across its lip. After the grinding faded, the clearing held a silence that seemed to lean inward, as if the jungle itself were listening. The crew stood facing the darkness, each with a different memory of the moment the stone jaw parted, and all with the same unspoken fear that stepping forward would be not just a movement but a declaration. The guide, Tupin, watched the shadow inside the mouth as a fisherman watches a river that has killed his friends yet keeps feeding his family. He said nothing at first. The air that drifted out was warm and carried the taste of old iron and damp stone. The statue's eyes did not blink, but they were not idle. They had the patience of a watcher who has forgotten how to sleep. The captain, Ramirez, checked his equipment the way men test their courage by touching the tools that make them useful. Rope, lamp, canteen, the small kit he pretended was for blisters but held a photograph folded until the creases looked like rivers. Camila felt words building in her throat and swallowed them. The Quechua phrases that came at times like this were for a world with boundaries. She did not know if prayers born on mountain air would find a place to land under a stone that breathed. Ernesto tightened his pack straps and looked up to read the sky as if it could offer advice, then remembered there was no sky where they were going. Pereira knelt, put his palm flat on the earth, and felt the thrumming through the soil like the purr of some gigantic cat. Anna's palms were moist. She thought of Mateo's quiet eyes in the museum and of the compass that spun until witnesses returned to the room. She thought of the photograph in the archive that showed noon and a sky full of stars beyond a stone arch. Her chest lifted and fell with the soft pulse that seemed to roll out of the darkness in patient waves. Tupin broke the hush by laying a line around the base of a buttress root and tying it in a knot he had been taught by a man who had not reached old age. He handed the free end to Ramirez. "You will want to think you have done this before," he said, "but you have not. Walk on the exhale. When it inhales, stand still. If you move against its breath, you will become lost and never know how it happened." His voice had no drama in it, only instruction. He raised his lamp. Its flame leaned inward as if hungry. The tunnel mouth was tall enough for two men to enter shoulder to shoulder. The first step down shaved the temperature by a breath. Moisture collected on skin and lamps, turning metal slick. The air inhaled. It was not a gust. It was a pull. Anna felt the hairs on her forearms lift as the exhalation came, warm and faintly salted, brushing cheeks and fingertips. Ramirez raised a hand, and they moved. The lamps showed polished stone, not rough earth. The walls had been shaped by intention. The curve of the tunnel was not the lazy bend of water making its way. It was the geometry of decision. The floor was not slippery, but it flexed with a give so subtle that only Pereira noticed it. He did not say so. Words would have broken something he could not name. The tunnel led to a chamber that widened like a spoon, and the air grew deep again. They held still for the inhale the way a person pauses a step when an auditorium draws breath before a performance. In the light they lifted, faces looked back at them from the walls. Hundreds. Each one with the mouth open, the lips sculpted mid-scream, the tongues visible, the teeth not uniform but particular, with chips and crookedness and years carved into them. They were not masks. They were people's last moments set in stone. Some wore feathered headdresses. Some wore helmets. Some wore neither. A child's mouth gaped above a carved necklace of seeds. An old woman's face was drawn back, the lines at the eyes deep enough for lichen to have found a home. The mouths were not all horror. Some looked like chanting. Some looked like laughter interrupted by surprise. But there is a kind of surprise that lives very close to terror, and the stone understood it. Funerary gallery, Pereira said softly, as if cataloging could domesticate what stood before them, binding the breath in witnesses. Yet his scholar's voice had a scratch in it. He touched his lamp closer and flinched. Heat rose from the faces. Not the heat of flame, but the warmth that comes from bodies. He placed the back of his fingers near a stone cheek. It felt roughly human. The geologist's tools weighed differently in his pack. Metal sensed old places and decided whether to behave. Ernesto stepped to the side to see how the carved gaze tracked movement and realized at once that the sense of being watched was not born only from the eyes of the sentinel above. The walls themselves carried a weight of attention. He breathed in time with the chamber because to do otherwise felt rude. The lamp oils trembled with the inhale as if the room were a lung and they were candles inside it. The light lifted microfilm off the stone. It looked like pollen. It looked like ash. Camila's lips moved. She was not praying. She was translating the sentences that were not written, the sentences that figures such as these carry on their faces. She knew the term in the old stories, waka, a place where the world opens inward. She knew another word that matched what her bones were telling her, chemic, the breath that animates matter. The Incas believed in a world fed by breath, not only by blood. They believed that stones can hold life when life asks them to. What she did not know how to place was the European iron along the flanks of some of these carved demons, the curve of a breastplate, the angle of a morion. The Spanish had brought metal and fever and a vocabulary of hunger and faith. It seemed they had also brought their own faces here to be made into warning. Tupin stood very still. His people did not name this place. They lived next to it, the way villagers live next to a cliff. He recognized some features carved in a style not his own. He recognized other features too, older than empires. The open mouths watched him and seemed to breathe in his stead. He remembered his father telling him that some doors cannot be closed once a child knows their outline. He had known this outline since he had learned to hunt. He felt no triumph at having come inside. He felt the old duty at his back like a hand. They crossed the chamber while the room exhaled, and when it inhaled again, they found themselves at another opening, a throat narrower than the first. The tunnel beyond did not invite their light generously. The gleam ran along ridges like water along ribs. Here the carved faces had changed. The mouths remained open, but the eyes had closed as if in the instant before impact. Between them were small channels, too regular to be cracks, running from mouth to mouth. The channels were faintly slick. Anna reached a finger without thinking and drew it back at the taste of salt on her tongue a moment later, although she had not touched it to her lips. Memory mouths, Pereira thought, not saying the phrase aloud. The room inhaled and exhaled and the walls seemed to pulse a fraction, enough to move the air across skin like the passage of a faint breeze through hair. Ernesto lifted his camera and hesitated. The gallery of faces looked out from the past with a collective expectation that photographs would not satisfy. Still, record is the other half of discovery. He framed a shot and pressed the shutter. The image came up washed in pale, the mouth's perfect black ovals. He took another. In it, the eye of a man in a flanged helmet reflected a glint. He lowered the camera and lifted it again and almost dropped it. For an instant the eye had been wet. Not gloss. Liquid. A blink so slight it might have been a tremor of light. He swallowed. The words he had prepared to steady the crew slid away from his tongue like fish from a net. "I saw it," he said. "I saw one." He did not finish. Camila was looking at a different face entirely, breathing in hitching patterns, her gaze locked on a stone child's open throat. The rasp that came was not fear. It was a sound like grief meeting itself halfway across time. She had sung to a cousin as a child while fever took him and had never changed the way she breathed since. Now the room asked her to change. It tugged gently at her ribs the way a sleep asks for deeper sleep. They came to a second chamber, larger, with a ceiling too high for their light to find. The floor dipped. The air cooled to the kind of cold found at the bottom of wells. A fine vapor lay upon the stone like the breath of sleeping cattle. As their lamplight moved, the vapor shifted in and out in small waves, echoing the inhale and exhale. The faces here wore different expressions. Not only screams. Some held their mouths open as if to pass breath toward the center. Others held their tongues tense as if refusing to give it back. Between every third face, a symbol waited, repeated in a ring that circled the room. A small sun crossed by 3 spokes, a sign that had been on the leather map like a signature. Each symbol caught lamp glow like an eye. Each seemed to know their names. They tried to mark their passage. A chalk arrow, drawn quickly when the breath allowed movement. A length of twine wound on a batten, unspooling behind. But chalk lines grew damp and swam. The twine tugged with the inhale and slackened with the exhale, crawling along the stone as if impatient. Twice they came back to the same broken step they could have sworn they had not seen before. Tupin called them to listen, not to him but to the room. He counted in a whisper with the breath. On the 4th inhale, he said the walls would pull. On the 5th exhale, the pull would loosen. On the 6th inhale, the pull would reverse. Pattern lived inside the impossible. They began to move with it, not against. The labyrinth rewarded that courtesy with a corridor that curved left like a rib. They found inscriptions cut into a lintel so worn that only habit could tease syllables from it. Camila traced them with a forefinger. The letters were not Spanish, not fully Quechua either. They were the kind of writing that comes from marrying 2 tongues to make a single oath. The phrase repeated, hesitation carved into stone by a hand that had not wanted to finish. She sounded it gently. The sun waits for no shadow. The sentence had been on the margins of the leather, spoken by Mateo in a room that no longer knew his breath. It lived here too, deep under the guardian, old as the decision to set a mouth in stone and feed it time. Beyond the lintel a bridge crossed a chasm. The lamps showed vapor rising from below, hardly a mist, more like the idea of mist. Their light could not hold on to it. The breath here moved side to side as well as in and out, a complicated rhythm that demanded attention. The bridge was a slab only 3 feet wide with no handrails and a surface grooved by centuries of feet. Ramirez went first. Men who have commanded crews learn early the loneliness of first steps. He placed his saws on the stone and felt it answer with a dull thud that was neither their weight alone nor the stone's own report, but a union of both. A current of air from the chasm lifted the hair on his arms. He thought of his watch showing a date that did not belong in a modern pocket and put down that thought the same way a man puts down a glass he cannot afford to drop. Halfway across, he looked down against his better judgment. The light fell into darkness not far and then did not return. No depth revealed itself. There were points of glimmer there, like mica caught in a lamp beam, but they were too distant for stone and too steady for reflection. They looked like stars laid flat beneath their feet. Camila did not look down. She kept her eyes on the back of the captain's shoulders and whispered the breath Count Tupin had taught them. Anna crossed last, urging herself not to think of thin ice on a well that had taken a neighbor boy when she was a child. The breath met her halfway and steadied her steps, and she thanked it without using a word. The next corridor narrowed to the point where their shoulders brushed the walls. Faces still watched, but here another element had entered the architecture. Along the floor ran channels shallow as thumbprint grooves. In the exhale, warm air moved along them toward the deeper chambers. In the inhale, cool air reversed. The grooves did not run straight. They threaded, divided, and rejoined like braided hair. Within them, tiny beads of what looked like quicksilver rolled with the air, clicking softly against the stone when the direction changed. Pereira crouched. He had seen mercury only in instruments and in the fever camps where miners paid for silver with their mines. He did not like seeing it behave with a kind of thought. He touched the chamber floor and felt his own pulse reflected back through the stone a half-beat late. He withdrew his hand and wiped it on his trousers and did not look at Anna because he did not want to be the first to say what was obvious. The labyrinth had learned to listen. They stopped at a cistern where water lay so still that light sat upon it like a thing that had decided to rest rather than a thing spread thin. The surface showed them not themselves but a ceiling that did not exist, a firmament wrinkled like skin. Ernesto crouched and breathed out toward the water. The surface pulled his breath into itself and made no ripple. He felt foolish immediately and also forgiven. Tupin stepped to the edge and dropped in a scrap of leaf. It sank as if through air and did not stop. Anna watched until it became a green memory and then nothing. The walls ahead carried a new kind of carving. Not faces. Hands. Open palms pressed into stone with fingers sure and spread. Large hands, small hands, a child's hands so tiny it could not have belonged to any of them unless time had run backward. Between the hands were small notches like tally marks. Camila counted without meaning to. She did not want to know if the notches matched the number of faces. She did not want to decide whether the tallies were for those who went in or for those who came out. A passageway turned and returned to the first chamber as if the room had lifted and set itself down. They were not lost. The labyrinth insisted. The breath had gathered them into its pattern. The only way to be lost here was to refuse to breathe. Sound shifted. A whisper of flutes came from far ahead, not sweet, not shrill, a tone like air moving over bottles at different water levels. Someone had tuned stone to play. The melody was neither minor nor major. It stepped outside those choices. Ernesto rubbed his arms. Childhood, he thought for no reason. Markets. Heat above roofs. A voice calling a name that did not belong to him and still made him turn. He shook his head. The tune remained. The crew moved forward as if the breath had set a metronome at the back of their throats and their steps obeyed. They entered a chamber unlike the others. Its floor was smooth. Its walls held no faces. Instead, reliefs had been cut into long horizontal panels, telling a story the way cultures speak without words. A procession of figures with burdens passed under a sun that grew larger in each panel until it filled the strip from top to bottom. Then the sun split. Two smaller suns floated apart, connected by a braided line like the one on the leather map. Between them stood a figure crowned in reeds. The figure did not only face east or west. The artist had tried to carve directionlessness and nearly succeeded. At the end of the panels, a city rose under leaves without sunlight. It wore walls with mouths for gates. The last panel had been deliberately damaged. Hammer marks canceled a face that might have been familiar. The stone showed bruises, and the bruises had healed. They found scratches lower, where a hurried hand had carved letters later in time. Some in Spanish, cramped. Some in quipu knots pressed into softened clay and left to harden, a rebellion against the loss of a language of strings. Camila read aloud without hearing herself. Do not count us. Counting draws it nearer. Do not draw it. Drawing is invitation. Breathe in when it breathes in, or it will take your breath the way a lender takes a house. Someone had signed a name and then cut it away. It is one thing to be erased by enemies. It is another to erase oneself so that the tomb cannot call without a mouth. The last corridor was narrower still. The breath lengthened. The exhale lasted long enough to invite a story. The inhale came back with the steady patience of death. The floor rose. They climbed. Sweat ran in neat lines. Lamps burned low. Above the line of their light, something waited without reflection. When they reached it, they found a door the size of a carriage, set flush within the stone as if the earth had grown it. It was not polished gold. It was hammered, its surface worked by thousands of small blows until it rippled. Patterns flowed across it, rays in threes, braided currents, circles nested within circles. The metal gave off warmth the way a sleeping animal shares itself with a hand. Pereira set his palm to it and closed his eyes. He had touched or washed from rivers, church chalices salvaged from burned villages, coins pulled from silt that remembered the shapes of the mouths that had kissed them for luck. This was none of those. He felt, beneath the gold's patience, a second heartbeat. Not rhythm as such, Cycles. Tides moving in a body that did not hold water. He opened his eyes. There will be a hinge that is not a hinge, Tupin said. It opens when the room exhales and the person before it does not clench. People will try to be brave and they will draw their shoulders tight. The door does not reward muscle. It rewards release. He placed a hand near the edge and waited. The breath pulled in. He held still. The breath flowed outward. He breathed with it. The gold shifted by a hair. Now, he said quietly. They pushed together with nothing of force and all of willingness, and the door accepted the press of their palms as if it had been yearning not for strength but for consent. It moved with a sound like a bell untouched by human fingers. Warm air washed over them, smelling not of metal now but of sun-warmed floorboards and milk, of wet canvas and a sugar burned too long on a stove. The lamps dimmed not from lack of oil but from a change in the light around them. They took one step across the threshold. The chamber beyond did not open into stone. It did not present relics or a tomb lit by blue fire. It opened into a small room with a window looking out on a field that had once held maize and now held blackened posts. The light through the window was the kind that comes after rain in late afternoon. On a shelf a blue mug sat with a hairline crack along its rim. An embroidered cloth with careless daisies lay on a table that had a scuff where a heel had tapped during a lesson. A pair of shoes too small for any of them sat near the doorway with their laces in knots a child would call bows. A smell of bread that would never come out of the oven filled the air in a kindness the past offers only to those it intends to keep. Anna did not hear anyone say her name. She did not hear the lamp handles click as hands forgot what they were holding. She did not hear the long inhalation of the room that had once taught her the size of doors. Her hands lifted without being asked, touching the edge of the table where a knife had marked wood by accident. The mark was still there. The jar with buttons gathered by a mother stood where it always had. The curtain that had frayed in the sun lay in the chair where she had sat stitching the line back together because her mother's hands had been too tired that day. She had dreamt this place 100 times and had allowed her mind to revise it to keep it from breaking her. The tomb returned it without revision. The kindness kept only the hurt. Pereira looked at her and understood without needing to ask. He had seen minds return men to themselves in ways that were not gifts. Ramirez took one step in and stopped as if he had stepped onto a deck that had decided to become a shore. Outside the window, a line of smoke rose that did not move. It hung the way a photograph hangs, forever the same second. A small bell sat on the shelf, and if a hand had rung it, the sound would have called goats in a field that no goats would ever cross again. The breath of the labyrinth came and went, and the curtains answered as if they were lungs. Camila stood just inside the door and did not write any of this down because some words betrayed. Ernesto tried to anchor himself by counting the nails in the floor and lost track when one nail he could not see made his vision blur. Tupin stood with his hat in his hands the way a man stands with a hat in a church that also houses a woman's wake and a child's name day. Two ceremonies that should not share a room but do. A voice spoke, but it came from no throat in the doorway, no mouth carved in stone. It had the sound of familiarity worn thin by use. "Welcome home," it said in the language of childhood, which is to say in the rhythm of breath. The lamps burned steady. The door waited open behind them. The golden surface did not gleam now. It held their reflections not as light but as silhouettes. Anna set her palm on the chair back. The wood carried a warmth that did not care what century asked to be comforted. She turned slowly, her eyes flooded and steady at once, knowing that when she looked at her companions she would see their faces folded into the faces of the people they had once been when rooms had still been simple and days had still been counted by sunlight and not by fear. She turned to say the name of the person whose absence had made that room echo for years. Before the name could form, the breath drew in, not gently now, not harshly either, but with decision, and the curtain lifted exactly the way it had lifted on the day that had burned memory into her skin. The crew stood on the threshold of a tomb deep under a sentinel in a jungle, and all at once they were standing in a room that had waited for one of them to come back and pretend for the space of a heartbeat that time is kind. The golden door did not close. The labyrinth did not roar. It held them with the patience of stone that has learned to breathe, asking nothing yet asking everything. The golden door did not creak or slam shut. It simply stood ajar, as if it had never been anything else. Beyond it, the room breathed with the same quiet rhythm as the labyrinth, yet the air inside felt warmer, closer, as if it belonged not to the stone but to the people now standing on its threshold. Anna was the first to step fully inside. Her room, if it could be called that, had not shifted from what she saw moments earlier. Her childhood kitchen, the scent of bread still hovering like a memory too stubborn to fade. She could hear the scrape of her mother's knife against the cutting board, and in the corner, the old radio hummed softly, just as it had during rainy afternoons. But when she turned her head, the others were not standing in the same space she was. Ernesto, closest to her, was staring into a completely different world. His eyes had gone soft, unguarded, as though he'd forgotten why they were here. The air around him shimmered faintly, showing the outline of a small stone courtyard. A laundry line swayed gently in a breeze that Anna could not feel. On the far side, a girl of no more than 8 years old sat cross-legged on the ground, weaving a palm frond into a braid. Her hair was the same coal-black as Ernesto's, her eyes too large for her thin face. She looked up, and the joy that cracked across his features was so raw it made Anna look away. "Isabel," Ernesto's voice was barely above a whisper. "Mi hermana." He took a half step forward, but the girl's mouth moved first, shaping words Anna could not hear. Ernesto froze, his smile faltering. He tilted his head, listening. Then confusion crept in. The girl's voice, whatever she was saying, was making his shoulders stiffen, his knuckles tighten. Anna strained to catch the words but heard only a strange undercurrent, like the sound of wind forced through a hollow bone. Camila was off to the side, her own vision unfolding. She was seated on a thick rug before a low fire. Across from her, an older man in a worn alpaca sweater leaned forward in his chair, a book open on his lap. He was reading aloud in Quechua, the words rising and falling like a lullaby. Camila's lips moved with them, remembering. But then the voice in the story hesitated, tripped over a phrase, and began again, but not with the same words. His tone shifted, becoming slower, heavier, deliberate. He looked up from the page, and his gaze held something urgent. Camila's eyes narrowed, not in fear, but in recognition. The words he spoke next carried across the room in a language every one of them understood. "Do not feed the king." Ramirez stood apart, his boots planted on the rough boards of a ship's deck that had no right to be here underground. The wind pressed against his back, and salt stung his face. Before him, the horizon stretched endlessly, and from below deck came the sound of laughter and mugs clinking. Then the door to the captain's quarters swung open, and a figure stepped out. A tall man in weathered leather armor, his hair tied back with a strip of crimson cloth. He looked at Ramirez as if measuring him. When he spoke, it was not in greeting. "It waits for hunger," the man said evenly. "It always waits for hunger." Pereira's vision was perhaps the cruelest. He stood in the dry heat of a mining camp, a line of men hauling sacks past him. His father was among them, bent under the weight but smiling just enough to hide the sickness that was eating him. Pereira's breath caught, his hand reaching out. His father looked up, but instead of greeting him, the man said in a voice both his own and not his own, "Once it knows your breath, it will not forget." Tupin had not stepped through the threshold. He stood with his hands still on the edge of the golden door, his gaze fixed not on what was inside but on the air just beyond. He could see the shimmer that wrapped each of them in their own vision, like the overlapping ripples of stones thrown into a single pool. His lips moved silently, shaping a prayer not meant for gods but for the living. Inside the shifting space, Anna's room began to change. The light at the window dimmed, the smell of bread fading to something stale, metallic. The familiar edges blurred, like watercolor bleeding across wet paper. Her mother's voice, humming in the other room, deepened, not in tone but in weight, as if the sound itself had grown older, heavier. Then came the words. "Where the sun never dies," her mother's voice said. But Anna's mother had never spoken that phrase. The words landed in her bones like a memory she had inherited rather than lived. She turned sharply toward Ernesto, but his room was changing too. The courtyard dissolved, the laundry line vanishing into mist. Isabel's face grew pale, her eyes sinking deeper into shadow. She leaned forward, placing a finger against her lips, and whispered something that made Ernesto's breath hitch. Anna caught only the end of it, before it eats. Camilla's fire sputtered, the pages of the book in the old man's lap curling inward as though the heat came from somewhere else. The man's face sagged, the wrinkles deepening into cracks. His voice had become the same hollow-bone sound that had haunted Ernesto's vision. Ramirez's ship creaked violently beneath his feet. The waves stilled, the horizon froze, and from behind him came the sound of something heavy dragging across wet planks. He did not turn. The voice of the leather-armored man was now only a whisper in his ear. The king is always hungry. The warmth in Pereira's mining camp evaporated into a still, cold air. His father stopped mid-step, the sack slipping from his shoulder, and turned toward him fully. His eyes were gone. In their place was a blackness that reflected faint glimmers, like starlight on water. The voices grew in unison, overlapping, building like the wind before a storm. Some were in Spanish, some in Quechua, some in words that belonged to no human tongue at all. But all of them said the same thing: "Feed the king." The sound pressed against their skulls, vibrating the air inside their chests. The rooms around them flickered faster, melting between memory and stone, between comfort and ruin. The air thickened, and for a moment, the crew's breath no longer matched the rhythm of the labyrinth. Then, without warning, the walls began to run. It was not a collapse. It was a melting. The colors of each vision, sunlight, firelight, shadow, streamed downward like paint under heavy rain, pooling at their feet before seeping into the ground. The boards of Ramirez's ship dissolved into the same stone as Anna's kitchen floor, which in turn bled into the carved faces of the labyrinth. The breathing stopped. Where the walls had been, there was now a single vast chamber, its ceiling lost in darkness. At its center stood a throne of stone so ancient it seemed grown from the earth itself. Its arms were carved in the likeness of serpents, their heads meeting above the seat, fangs bared in eternal guard. Dust clung to every surface, but it was not the dust of disuse. It was the dust of centuries that had been allowed to settle as part of the throne's skin. Seated upon it was a figure. At first glance, it could have been mistaken for a statue, its form shriveled and bent, the skin stretched taut and dry over bones like parchment over twigs. But there was no mistaking the crown, thick gold, dented in places, set with gems so dark they swallowed the light instead of reflecting it. The crown was unmistakable in the old paintings and sketches, the crown of Álvaro Cortez, the explorer king. The figure's head tilted ever so slightly forward, as if acknowledging them. And though no breath came from its mouth, Anna could have sworn she heard the faintest sound echo in her chest, not in her ears, a sound that might have been a voice, or might have been the earth itself speaking from under the throne. It said only one thing: hungry. The crown sat heavy on the shriveled brow, its dark jewels drinking in the lamplight. The figure had not moved since they first saw it, and yet each of them felt something shift, not in the room, but in their own skulls, as if invisible fingers had pressed against the inside of their thoughts. Then came the voice. It did not pass through the air. It did not touch their ears. It bloomed directly in their minds, like the memory of a voice they had once known in a dream. It was deep but frayed, as though dragged over centuries of stone and silence. "You have come far," the voice said, and though it spoke to all of them, it felt to each as if it spoke only to them. "Farther than most, but not farther than I." Anna's lamp trembled in her hand. The others stood rooted, their breaths shallow. The mummified lips did not part, yet the voice carried with the weight of command. "I am Álvaro Cortez," it continued, "once called the Explorer King, once feared, once envied, and now forgotten by all but the stones." A strange pressure filled the chamber, as though the air itself had thickened. The serpents carved into the throne's arms seemed to glisten, though no moisture touched them. Cortez's hollow eyes, sockets with no flesh, tilted imperceptibly toward them. "This," the voice said, "is no grave. It is a prison." The words rang with a resonance that made the walls hum. "For centuries I searched," he went on. "For gold, for glory, for the land where the sun never dies. I found it. And when I did, I found it was not a place for kings. It was a place for keeping them. The crew exchanged glances, but none dared speak aloud. I am bound here, Cortez said, by an oath I did not make, but which my blood accepted. The tomb holds me, as it will hold any who stand within its breath for too long. Do you know why you still breathe? Because it wishes you to hear my bargain before it decides for you. Something in his tone made the back of Anna's neck prickle. You have a choice, Cortez said. A choice I did not have. You may join me, remain here, become part of my court. The tomb will keep your bodies as it has kept mine. You will not hunger. You will not thirst. You will be eternal, though eternity here is not the eternity of heaven. The pressure in their skulls tightened, and the air tasted faintly of iron. Or, the voice went on, soft as a blade sliding from a sheath, you may feed the tomb. Camilla's brow furrowed. Feed it what? The figure's head tilted slightly, the movement slow, deliberate, as though even a millimeter of motion required consent from the stone itself. It is not choosy, Cortez said. A life will do. One life for all the rest to go free. You may choose whose. The words slithered through their thoughts. They looked at one another now, really looked, and each of them felt the tremor of suspicion in the other's eyes. It has always been this way, Cortez said, since the first Inca who stumbled upon its gates, since the priests who bound me here. The tomb feeds on breath and memory. If you do not choose, it will choose for you. And when it does, it may not stop at one. A long silence followed, broken only by the distant, slow pulse of the labyrinth's breath. You lie, Pereira said finally, though his voice was dry. You want us to kill each other so you can keep us here. The hollow sockets seemed to deepen, shadows folding inward. If you think I hunger, Cortez said, you do not understand the king you stand before. I am no longer a man who eats or drinks, but I know hunger. It lives here in the walls. It does not wait forever. The heat of the room shifted to a cloying warmth, the kind that makes sweat stick like a second skin. Ernesto's eyes darted between the throne and the others, calculating without wanting to. Ana took a slow step back, her heel touching the edge of the golden door. It did not yield. Ramirez cleared his throat, though his voice was tight. If this is a prison, he said, then you're no king. You're another prisoner, just with a bigger chair. The voice that answered was colder. Do you think I asked for this crown? It is not mine anymore. It belongs to the tomb. I am its mouthpiece, its herald, and now, perhaps, your judge. The words hung like the taste of ash. Cortez's head lifted, and though it still did not move in the human sense, the voice seemed to draw closer, as if his presence had stepped into the space between their heartbeats. You have little time, he said. The breath grows shallow. When it draws deep again, it will decide. Feed it before then. A soft sound came from Tupin, the first he had made since they entered the chamber. It was not a word, just a long exhale, like someone preparing to act before doubt could speak. And then it happened. Without warning, without any change of expression, Tupin's arm shot out and shoved Ernesto forward toward the throne. The push was not gentle. Ernesto stumbled, his lamp swinging wildly, its light flaring across the stone serpents and the sunken face of Cortez. He let out a startled cry, his boots scuffing against the step that led to the throne. The air in the chamber shifted instantly, rushing inward, as if the labyrinth itself had taken a sudden breath in anticipation. Ana shouted his name. Camila moved forward on instinct, but the golden door behind them gave a low, resonant hum, like something locking into place. And Cortez's voice filled them again, richer now, almost eager. One life, he said, for the rest. The chamber waited. The tomb waited. And in the heavy, unmoving air, they could all feel that time had begun to run out. Ernesto's knees hit the stone with a crack. His lamp clattered from his grasp, rolling in a weak circle before its light steadied. The glow caught the gold crown above Cortez's head, making the gem seem to swell with shadow rather than brightness. The air inside the chamber shifted, less like wind and more like the deep pull of some invisible tide. The walls began to move, not with the slow, imperceptible breath the crew had felt since entering, but with a fevered rhythm, inhaling and exhaling as if the entire tomb were waking from a long and dangerous sleep. Stone veins that had been dull and dark now glowed from within, their molten light crawling upward like fire through capillaries. The pressure in their skulls deepened, and Cortez's voice returned, heavy with something close to satisfaction. "It accepts," he said. Ernesto struggled to his feet, his eyes wide with panic. "I didn't agree to anything." The floor trembled under him, cutting him off. The molten light was spreading fast now, tracing every seam in the stone, marking the walls, the floor, even the throne itself in a lattice of fire. The heat rose with it, carrying a metallic scent that made the back of Anna's throat sting. Camila grabbed Ernesto's arm and yanked him backward. "We're leaving," she hissed, though her voice cracked with the effort of making sound over the growing hum in the chamber. The golden door that had sealed itself before now stood open, but beyond it the corridor was not as they had left it. The smooth walls were rippling, folding into new shapes as if molded by unseen hands. Pereira hesitated. "What if it just leads us back?" "We don't have time." Anna snapped, shoving him toward the opening. They ran. The corridor was longer than it had been, twisting at angles too sharp for human architecture. The glowing veins followed them, branching ahead as though the light were alive, anticipating their path. Every turn seemed to change behind them, sealing into fresh stone, forcing them deeper into whatever direction the tomb allowed. Cortez's voice followed, no longer patient, no longer still. "You could have stayed," it said, the words spilling into their minds as easily as breath. "You could have ruled. You could have worn the crown beside me." No one answered. Their footfalls echoed unnaturally, as though the sound were being thrown back at them from ahead, too close, too soon. "I can give you gold," the voice continued. "More than the world can carry. I can give you years, centuries. No hunger, no decay." Anna's chest burned with the effort of running, but she refused to slow. The light ahead deepened into red, and she realized it was not daylight but another chamber. They spilled into it only to find the throne room. The molten veins webbed the walls more thickly now, and Cortez sat as before, his shrunken hands resting on the serpent arms, his crown seeming heavier on his brow. "You cannot leave without me," he said. "And I cannot leave without you." Camila's eyes flicked to the open archway they had just come through. It was gone. In its place was solid wall, glowing faintly as though mocking them. The floor shook harder, and cracks split the stone underfoot. From those cracks, a slow exhalation rose, hot, moist, as though the earth beneath were breathing directly into the chamber. The air thinned. Anna's vision blurred at the edges. "We have to move, now." They turned toward another corridor, but it too twisted back on itself, spilling them once again into the throne room. Cortez's voice was closer now, as if he stood among them. "You think this place is stone? It is alive. It keeps what it eats." The molten veins pulsed faster. The breathing of the tomb matched the pounding in their skulls, faster, faster, until Anna thought her head might split from the pressure. Ramirez shoved past, gripping Ernesto by the collar and dragging him toward the far wall. "There has to be a way out," he growled. He slammed his shoulder against the stone, and the wall gave way. It didn't crumble. It peeled, the stone rolling back like thick, wet hide. Beyond it was darkness, but it smelled faintly of water and leaves. Without hesitation, they plunged through. The passage they found themselves in was narrow and sloped upward. The molten light still chased them, but here it seemed dimmer, as though the tomb's heart could not reach as far. The air cooled slightly, and Anna felt the faintest stirrings of wind, real wind, not the lunged breathing of the labyrinth. Cortez's voice, however, had not dimmed. It surged with desperation now. "Do you think the world you left will still be waiting? Time bends here. Time breaks. You may find only ash where you left green." They ignored him. The incline grew steeper, the air fresher. The last they saw it, lit pale daylight, cutting a thin blade into the dark ahead. They burst from the passage in a scramble, boots and hands clawing at the earth until they were outside. The sudden openness hit them like a slap, and for a moment no one moved, drinking in the air. But the sound of breathing did not stop. It was still behind them, somewhere deep below, slower now but steady, like the tomb was content to wait. Anna turned toward the riverbank. Relief was already forming in her chest when she froze. The river was gone. Where the water had flowed, a vast expanse of cracked earth stretched to the horizon. The jungle that had hugged the banks was gone too, replaced by dunes and ridges of sunburned sand. The air shimmered with heat, and in the far distance, the skeletons of trees stood half buried in the dust. Camila's voice was hoarse when she spoke. How is this possible? Ramirez said nothing. His eyes stayed fixed on the emptiness, as if hoping it might dissolve into the familiar green. Cortez's voice came one last time, faint but sharp, like a knife drawn across the inside of their thoughts. "I told you," it said. "Time bends here." And then there was only the desert, stretching endlessly before them, the heat already rising in waves, and no sign of the world they had fought to return to. The heat came at them in waves, not the damp heaviness of the jungle, but the dry, parching breath of an open furnace. Each step crunched in the shifting grit, fine as powdered glass, and the horizon rippled as if the world were a mirage. For a moment, they all simply stared at it, the endless sweep of ochre sand where the river had been, as if someone had stripped the skin off the earth and left it to bleach under an uncaring sun. And then they began to notice the shapes. Half-buried hulks rose from the dunes, their hulls rotted to lace, sails long devoured by the wind. The wood was warped, salt-scored, and in places fused into the sand as though the desert had tried to swallow them whole. Ships, Camila breathed, disbelief clinging to the word. Not riverboats. Not anything that could have sailed these waters even in flood. These were ocean galleons, their ribs split wide, cannons yawning toward a sky that had never known their battles. Their decks bore names in Spanish, Dutch, Portuguese, carved, painted, or scorched into their beams, some so faded they looked like scars. Between them lay bones. Some were the curling spines of whales, their ivory ribs arching out of the sand like the ruins of temples. Others belonged to creatures none of them could name, elongated skulls with spiraling horns, ribcages built for something that must have flown, but with claws that could have shredded bark from stone. The desert had kept them like relics, caught mid-motion, frozen in a death that did not match this land or its time. Ernesto crouched near one, brushing away the sand until the smooth curve of a jaw emerged. He froze when he found teeth the length of his fingers, each serrated like a saw. "This shouldn't be here," he murmured. "That is the point," Tupin said quietly. His voice was low, but the weight in it was enough to still their movements. He was standing a few paces back, his eyes scanning the horizon as though reading a story only he could see. When Anna asked what he meant, he didn't look at her. "This is another face of it," he said. "The curse. The land shifts when you try to leave. The river was only one path, one skin the tomb wears. When you fail to escape, it changes. Sometimes to forest, sometimes to stone, sometimes to this." Pereira let out a dry laugh that sounded more like a cough. "A desert full of shipwrecks? What's next, snow?" "It can be snow," Tupin said, and the way he said it left no space for mockery. Anna frowned. "And if it keeps shifting? Then you keep walking until it breaks you," Tupin replied. "Or until you find the breathless gate." They stared at him. "It is a place with no air," he explained. "No wind, no breath. When you stand there, it feels as if the world has forgotten you. It is the only way out, but the tomb moves it when it knows you are looking." No one asked how he knew. They began to walk. The sand hissed beneath their boots, and the sun pressed down until the air seemed thick enough to drink. Shadows from the wrecks stretched across the dunes, offering only momentary relief. The silence was oppressive. No birds, no insects, no whisper of moving air. Even their footfalls felt muted, as if the desert wanted no record of their passing. By midday, or what passed for it in a place that felt unbound from hours, the mirages began. A scrap of green shimmered in the distance, but when they drew closer it was only a warped section of hull with copper nails glittering in the light. Once, Anna thought she saw the curve of a familiar riverbank, the reflection of water dancing on the sand. It vanished as she blinked. Ernesto was the first to break the silence. If this is all part of the curse, then these ships, these bones, they're not just decoration. They're what's left of the others, aren't they? Tupin's lack of answer was answer enough. They passed a galleon split clean in two, its cargo spilling into the sand. Broken amphorae, rusted blades, a scattering of coins so worn they might have been blank. Anna kicked one aside and saw the faint outline of a face in profile, a crown resting on its head. The heat pulled the moisture from their skin, leaving their lips cracked. Camila stumbled, catching herself on the spine of some long-dead leviathan. Her fingers brushed over runes carved into the bone, symbols none of them recognized, yet which seemed to hum faintly under her touch. She pulled back quickly, her breath sharp. By late afternoon, the light had taken on a bruised edge, the sun sinking but the heat refusing to die with it. That was when Anna saw it, far on the horizon, a silhouette rising above the dunes. It was massive, taller than the highest mast, and even at this distance its shape was unmistakable. The same stone guardian they had seen in the jungle, the one whose eyes had followed them, whose mouth had begun to open. But here it was wrong. Its head was gone, sheared away cleanly at the neck. The rest of the figure stood half buried, one stone arm reaching toward the sky in either defiance or supplication. The armor, the carved headdress, it was all still there, but without the head, it looked both more human and more monstrous, as if the missing piece had been the only thing keeping it still. The sight rooted them where they stood. How? Pereira began, but the words faded before they could form sense. The headless sentinel stood unmoving in the heat shimmer, and yet Anna felt certain it had noticed them. The shadow it cast seemed to lean in their direction, stretching impossibly far over the dunes. Tupin's voice came again, soft and almost reverent. "It means we are closer." "Closer to what?" Camila asked. "To the gate," he said, "or to being swallowed whole." The windless air pressed against them, and for the first time since entering the desert, Anna thought she felt it, the faintest absence, like the world had taken half a breath and forgotten to finish. Somewhere beyond that broken giant, the desert was holding its breath, waiting for them to step closer. None of them said they would. None of them said they wouldn't. They just kept staring, each wondering if the missing head had fallen, or if it had walked away. Under the dying light of a cloudless evening, they found it, the headless statue standing in the heart of the desert, its massive body still carved in Spanish armor and Incan headdress, but the neck ending in a smooth ring of stone. The sand at its base had hardened like clay, cracked into patterns like old riverbeds, as if it had once been underwater. The air here felt different, heavy, as though it had been exhaled centuries ago and never replaced. No birds, no wind, not even the whisper of shifting grains. They approached in silence. Each footstep seemed louder than it should have been, as if the desert had been waiting to hear them. Anna placed a hand on the statue's foot and immediately recoiled. It was warm, not with the fading heat of the day, but with the strange, living warmth they had felt before, deep within the jungle. Pereira circled the base, brushing away the grit until he found it, a seam running upward toward the neck, almost invisible. The others gathered around as he pressed his fingers into the narrow gap. A low rumble followed, and then the seam widened, sand spilling away. Slowly, a circular doorway yawned open in the statue's neck, revealing a black shaft descending into the earth. Tupin's voice was quiet but firm. "The breathless gate," he said. He tested the air inside, holding his palm in the opening. No wind, no scent, nothing. He looked at them one by one. "If we go in, there is no turning back." They tied the last of their rope to the statue's armor and began the descent. The shaft was steep, the walls smooth from countless hands over an uncountable span of years. Steps appeared after several meters, carved shallow and wide. The air was dead, not stale, not suffocating, but simply absent, as if the tunnel existed outside the act of breathing. They descended in silence, their torches and lamps the only warmth in the void. Every sound felt muffled, pressed close to their ears instead of echoing away. Pereira touched the wall once and felt not stone, but something softer, a faint, pulsing give, like the inside of a living throat. After what felt like hours, the stairs ended at a great golden door, identical to the one they had opened deep in the labyrinth days ago. They exchanged glances but said nothing. Together they pushed. The door swung inward without resistance. They stepped into a room that should not have existed. It was not the tomb. It was not any place in the jungle or desert. It was home. Or rather, a home, but different for each of them. For Anna, it was her grandmother's kitchen, with the scent of coffee lingering in the air. For Pereira, it was his childhood room, the walls still painted with the faded blue his father had chosen. Camila saw the tiny apartment she had lived in as a student, every object exactly where she'd left it. The others murmured in confusion, each seeing something different. Then they realized the rooms were not right. Some objects were missing. Others were wrong in subtle ways, placed in places they had never been. And then the voices began. Soft, familiar voices. Parents, siblings, friends, calling to them in tones of love, coaxing them closer. Ramirez saw his brother sitting in a chair by the fire, smiling. Ana heard her mother singing an old lullaby. Pereira saw his father, bent over a map. But the words began to change. The smiles turned faintly strained. The voices whispered warnings, feed the king or stay forever. The warmth in the air grew oppressive. The walls seemed to soften, melting into shadow. And from that shadow, a throne emerged, stone and gold, adorned with coiled serpents. Upon it sat a figure in royal armor, desiccated and still, a crown of conquistadors make upon his head. His empty eyes locked on them. Of course, when he spoke, no mouth moved. His voice entered their minds directly, cold and resonant. The tomb is not a grave, he said. It is a court, my court, and it holds all who find it. They stood frozen. You may join me, he continued. Sit in my hall, walk my kingdom without hunger, without age, forever. Or feed the tomb so that it might let you leave. No one moved. Then, without warning, the torch in Ernesto's hand sputtered, casting the room in deeper shadow. Cortez's crown glinted. His voice grew softer, almost tender. You've already joined my court. You just haven't realized it yet. The torchlight died completely. The darkness closed in like velvet drawn over their eyes. They were left with only the sound of their own breathing, or was it breathing at all? And somewhere in that endless black, they knew the truth. The tomb never lets go. Even now, if you stand in the right corner of the world, you might feel it, that subtle shift in the air, that faint pull beneath your feet, as if something deep below were breathing. The tale of the Explorer King may have ended here tonight, but the curse he carries, the gates he guards, and the shifting lands that hide him are still out there, waiting for another set of footsteps. Perhaps you'll walk a jungle path that wasn't there yesterday. Perhaps you'll see a river flowing the wrong way, or hear whispers in a language you've never learned but somehow understand. And if you do, remember what you've heard here, because some doors cannot be shut once opened. If this journey gripped you, if it kept you staring into the shadows a little longer than you meant to, then stay with us. There are more forgotten cities, more cursed places, more pieces of the world's strange history that still beat with a pulse you can almost hear. Like this tale, share it with those who love to wander in the dark corners of the map, and let us know which mysteries call to you most. And if you haven't already, subscribe, not just to a channel, but to a path that leads far beyond the edges of the known world. Because the next story might already be looking for you.